Episode 19, Butter and Cheese. Finally, some dairy we can sell. Hello, and welcome to the History of American Food. This week, I'll be looking at the solid dairy products of the American cow. I'll explain how milk works, what it takes to make liquid dairy solid, and somewhat shelf-stable, and what it means to have to wash your butter before use. I'll also explain the difference between buttermilk, curds, and whey. So pull up to your place at the table, and let's dig in. Before we can dive into how butter and cheese moved around the 17th century British colonial food landscape, it's important to understand what milk is made of and how that allows butter and two distinct types of cheese to be made. So first of all, why is milk? What is the point of this substance that ties together all milk-excreting warm-blooded animals? And not just mammals, but marsupials like kangaroos and koalas, and monotremes, those egg-laying weirdos with fur, the platypus, and the echidna. Milk is the perfect baby food. Mammals and their close kin, when they are born, are incomplete and some variation of helpless. They are often blind, lack the fur they need to face the world, and are usually toothless and incapable of grasping or chewing their adult food. Baby mammals have digestive systems not entirely ready to process the foods they will eat as adults. They need to do lots of growing, and they need to do it fast. So milk is a concentrated food that provides the energy and the building blocks necessary to jumpstart the growth that will transform a tiny baby to a bouncing, rambunctious toddler with teeth, a fairly functional digestive system, and the coordination to start to acquire food on their own. Once the animals are able to get enough food on their own and digest it correctly, they no longer need milk. This process can take a few weeks for tiny things like shrews, up to years for larger animals like elephants and gorillas, and even more complicated omnivores that require long periods of development before they are self-sufficient. Once that requirement for milk is gone, it may seem efficient for a body to stop producing the enzymes needed to digest milk, specifically the milk sugar lactose, and concentrate on other things like puberty, but not always. Pastoral societies that started dairying, that is, moving from just using their herd animals for meat and hair and hides to also gathering and processing their milk, those individuals within the group that retain their lactose tolerance, the ability to fully use the sugar in milk, tended to have an energy advantage over the other group members that couldn't access lactose energy later in life. Never turning off the lactase, the enzyme that digests lactose, simply gave them a resource lost to those who could no longer efficiently digest lactose for energy. For a long time, a single class of mutations was supposed to allow this later in life milk drinking, and they are shared across India, Central Asia, and Europe. However, more recent research done by Sarah Tishkoff at the University of Pennsylvania has shown that there are 3 or 4 entirely separate mutations that result in lactase retention and later in life lactose tolerance. These mutations are found in different groups of pastoral societies from the Arabian Peninsula, East Africa, and some that range south of the Sahara Desert. In Neolithic times, the food economy was incredibly tight, so even little advantages, like access to milk sugar energy, could be magnified. And milk drinking was one of those seemingly little differences that gave people who had it an edge. As a result, multiple adaptations to retain lactose digestion have occurred and have lasted into the modern age. So what is the world's first combo superfood and energy drink made of? Milk is water-based, which means the fats in it are not dissolved, but rather exist as little droplets. Lactose and other sugars and some minerals are dissolved in the water part, and then there's a broad array of proteins. Some of the proteins are small and individual and dissolve in the water phase, but most of the proteins clump together and are suspended in the water rather than dissolved, which is what makes milk white and opaque. It's like fog, where tiny little particles of water are suspended and make light bounce off of them. So everything is white and opaque. But in milk, instead of water suspended in air, like fog, it's protein clumps that are suspended in water. The technical name for a fluid with all sorts of stuff suspended in it is emulsion. And the key thing here is that emulsions can be manipulated so they separate into their component parts. So let's start separating. The easiest part to separate out from milk is the fat. Just as any time you've made salad dressing by shaking oil and vinegar and some other stuff together, if you let it sit, the oil floats to the top. Same thing with cow milk. If you let fresh cow milk just sit there, the cream or the milk fat floats to the top. And because milk fat is solid at cooler temperatures, it will glom together in even larger blobs as the temperature drops. But as you know, cream is not butter. So what's the difference? Water. Cream is a water base with largish globs of fat and a bit of protein crowded pretty close together. But the water is on the outside of everything. How do you change the first thing into the second thing? Agitation. The colonial way was to collect a bunch of cream and churn it. Since this process could take up to 2 hours, the amount had to be worth the time spent. On a larger farm or dairy, this could happen daily, and dairy maids or the farm wife could make sweet butter from fresh cream. But on a small farm, the cream would be collected over 4 or 5 milkings, or up to 2.5 days. Even kept in a cellar, spring house, or hung down a well, the cream would start to clabber. The endemic or local bacteria would munch away on the lactose and make lactic acid, lowering the pH and making things sour. This soured butter was typical, to the point where the sweet butter was the rare thing that got the modifier. You can now find cultured butter in fancy grocery stores. It's basically churned creme fraiche or clotted cream. But back to the churning. This is just making the cream slosh around forcefully so the fat sticks together in larger and larger blobs and pushes the water phase out from between the blobs. And the slightly soured cream at a cold temperature was preferred since it made it easier to get the cream to clump together. This was done in those iconic tub churns that can still be found in antique stores and fewer grandma's attics. I grew up with my great-grandmother's last and least used one as our home umbrella stand. It was an Appalachian hardwood specimen, which is why it was so sturdy. And maybe a sign I was always fated to take on this project. Anyway, the cream would be forcefully sloshed about with a wooden dasher. That's that plunger you see in all the engravings. I'll be sure to include a photo of this device in the show notes. Once the fat blobs had all glommed together into chunks of butter and pushed out most of the water, the churning phase was done, but the butter wasn't. After it was churned, it would need to be thoroughly rinsed to remove any stray buttermilk, which contained water, sugar, and proteins that would go sour and foul the butter. After rinsing the butter, it would be thoroughly salted. What makes butter solid and opaque is the fact that it is still about 20% water. It's just now the fat is on the outside, surrounding small amounts of water and proteins instead of the other way around. To further protect the butter from going from just sour to actually rancid, so much salt would be folded into the butter that when making fancy things, especially stuff with sugar, it was common to rinse some of the salt out of the butter before using it. Once the butter was salted, it was pressed into butter molds and stored in the coolest place possible. It was quite shelf-stable for a dairy product and was an export from the dairying areas in the northern colonies and Pennsylvania. Butter could be sent south to Virginia, the Carolinas, and to Barbados and other sugar islands. It was also included in naval stores. Buttermilk was the leftovers from churning butter. This was the liquid most closely associated with the word clabber, the lightly soured milk I mentioned in the last episode. Along with being a popular refreshing drink, it was also used in pottage and combined with cornmeal mushes and cornbread. Late in the century, it could even be found as an ingredient in baking and a few sauces. Currently, all buttermilk in stores is labeled cultured buttermilk because almost all butter is made with sweet cream, and thus the buttermilk is also sweet. To make it the acidy stuff that does all the things we expect buttermilk to do, it must be cultured by adding a little specially selected lactose-munching bacteria. If you're feeling curious about churning, pop some cold cream in a jar and shake the dickens out of it. This is best done with a group or a few energetic children. You will get, eventually, butter and buttermilk. Both will be sweet and taste different than what you get at the store. Enjoy it all right away. You can also do this with a mixer if you've got one of those paddle attachments. If you want to keep that butter for longer, be sure to rinse it under cold water. Otherwise, the random bacteria hanging out in the air of your kitchen and your fridge, it'll start munching on the leftover buttermilk and turn your butter sour. And that would be a bummer. So that's butter making. How did people make cheese, and how does the structure of milk allow it to happen? Well, there's two basic kinds of cheeses, fresh or acid cheese, and then rennet or enzyme cheese. While there are varieties of each type, with fresh cheeses, there's just a few, but the rennet cheeses contain entire galaxies. Fresh or acid cheeses are believed to be the first sort of cheese people made, and seems to have developed repeatedly and independently in Central Asia, India, Europe, and East Africa as each different pastoral herding culture settled down to village life. Because cheese eating does not require lactose tolerance the way milk drinking does, cheese and butter consumption does go on where people do not drink sweet or uncultured milk later in life. Cheese is almost always made with whole or partly skimmed milk. That is, milk where none or only part of the milk fat has been removed. Skim milk cheese was possible, but it was chalky and often soured quickly and was not favored. Both fresh and rennet cheeses are the result of one class of proteins, the caseins, coagulating and holding on to any fat in the mix. The leftover liquid, known as whey, contains the globulin and albumin proteins and a few other nutrients. In the tight food economy of the time, the whey would be used in pottage to boost its nutrition or fed to livestock, to the milk cows as part of the grain mash, or to the pig if one were kept close to the house. The 17th century British colonists came from a very limited cheese tradition, and I will stay in that lane. We'll get further into cheese varieties as more food traditions hit the American shores. The fresh cheese the British colonists made was a version of what we know as cottage cheese, and their rennet cheeses were versions of what we know as cheddar. Cheese making requires large amounts of milk, and it also requires quite a bit of salt. Thus, cheese making didn't really get going until the latter half of the century, when both cows and salt were reasonably plentiful. It would only happen early in a cow's milking cycle when they were producing the most milk, or on larger multi-cow farms, or between groups of neighbors in collaboration. The fresh or farmer cheese made in the colonies would have been made from milk left to clabber a bit longer, the resident bacteria souring the milk by converting the lactose sugars into lactic acid. When the curd layer was thick enough, the mixture was gently heated to encourage the curds to sort of clump together more tightly and push out more of the whey. The basins and strainers and ladles and cloths used in this operation were all boiled thoroughly because there was a very big difference in encouraging the endemic bacteria, or as was known at the time, the vital elements in the milk, to make a tasty soured dish versus allowing random outsider bacteria or what would be thought of as bad airs in and creating rotten food. This is why dairying was often given its own space. Again, the colonists had no germ theory at this point. Bacteria wasn't known, but people who worked with dairy knew that they wanted to keep the process isolated to stop outside influences from messing with the curding process. Once curds of the proper size developed during the gentle heating, The mixture would be cooled and the whey drained away from the curds. The fresh cheese could be eaten this way as kind of a soupy thing. Or if a farm was prosperous and had cheese molds in a press, it could be salted and squeezed into a round to be kept a bit longer. Versions of this pressed fresh cheese can be found at modern farmers markets even now, usually sold as farmer's cheese and often include fresh herbs. The scraggly, bumpy, irregular cheese would never be aged, so it was always eaten young or green. So for all of you wondering, as I did, about this "the moon is made of green cheese" thing, this young, scraggly, bumpy cheese was the green cheese they meant, not something rotten and fuzzy or, colored green. Oh, how vocabulary changes on us. And now on to the sophisticated stuff, the rennet cheese. This was the stuff that could age, was packed in barrels, and could be sent to sea. The tricks of what temperatures, what local bacteria, how the curds were cut, cooked, and dried, and under what conditions the cheeses were kept, all added together to make different cheeses. In 17th century England, the fanciest cheese was Parmesan from Italy, and like any good craft guild, the exact methods were closely guarded. But general cheese-making methods were widely known, and the English had their own version, cheddar. So while 17th century royalty, the merchant classes, and Samuel Pepys were eating and hoarding Parmesan, the colonists were sorting out the American version of cheddar. And like all cheeses of the day, colonial cheddar was a raw milk cheese. All that means is the cheese was made using the bacterial colonies or vital forces it arrived with from the cow. It also meant cheese one farm over was likely going to taste a bit different than yours, and the equipment you used had to be very clean to encourage just the local colony you wanted. While fresh cheeses were expected to coagulate with just their own acid produced from their own local bacterial cultures, rennet cheeses started the same way. But the rennet in the form of a soaked square of calf stomach was added to alter the casein proteins a second time. It changed them from just bunchy, which allowed them to make curds under the influence of the acid, to stretchy. This, incidentally, is why rennet cheeses melt and make strings, but fresh cheeses do not. The enzyme cocktail of rennet causes the casein proteins in the milk to become elastic and sort of clump together in larger curds. These curds are cut and cooked and drained at a set of fussy temperatures and fussy times, while the cheesemaker had to look for subtle signposts in the changes of curd and whey behavior. Along with different bacterial cultures, different sets and orders of temperatures, cooking times, and curd treatments each resulted in different cheese outcomes. When the desired set of conditions were reached, the cheese curds would be salted and slowly pressed in cheese molds. Once enough whey had been pressed out, the cheese would alternately be rubbed with butter to prevent cracking and salt to form a hard protein rind on the outside. Then it was left to age in a humid location with a steady temperature, often, you guessed it, the spring house or in a cellar, or, in the best of all circumstances, a cave. Because caves were the ideal, the dairy barns of the best houses would be dug into hills. These new cheeses needed weekly salting, turning, and rubbing until a certain level of ripeness and enough hard rind was achieved. The cheese was usually pretty stable by then. Cheese sent to sea was ideally covered with wax, making them sturdier still. But wax was expensive and usually reserved for officers and personal cheeses, not the standard issue rations. There are many accounts of the fouled or chalky cheeses sailors were fed along with the subpar sour butter, suspicious salt beef, and maggoty biscuits as part of their Navy rations. But subpar Navy ration cheese aside, dairy workers were pulling off this complex and fussy task of cheese making using cauldrons over fires without a single thermometer in sight, from recipes they largely held in their heads. This should really emphasize what skilled work dairying truly was. If you're now interested in learning more about basic cheese-making methods and have become curious about the minutiae that goes into making cheddar or Parmesan or even farmer cheese, I've included links to the very helpful cheesemaking.com in the show notes, along with a few other interesting sources on the surprisingly long and widespread history of cheesemaking. As for how all this butter and cheese were consumed locally, as with most other foodstuffs at this point in colonial history, there was nothing elaborate. Butter was mainly eaten with something starchy, on corn mush or corn cakes, or to enrich a pottage. Bread and butter and cheese was a very common breakfast, as it was made of foods that could keep for a few days and were edible with no further cooking. Where people were a little more affluent and thus had a spider and a pipkin and maybe bowls or wood trenchers for eating, it might be used in sauces. Butter could be used to pan fry foods, but deep frying was still way off in the future, because as with lard, there was just not enough butter to do that. And vegetable oils from nuts or seeds or olives, this was still not even thought of in the British colonies. Cheese was eaten as is, with bread and possibly some pickled vegetables, which to this very day appears on many a pub menu as ploughman's lunch. And if I have any British listeners at this point, I have a feeling you can hear that I spelled plough incorrectly. It could also appear as an ingredient in a pie, but in an age when most things were boiled or simmered or stewed in a pot with an occasional turn in a spider over coals, cheese sauces and melting cheese over things was not yet a part of the cuisine. Fancy things like macaroni and cheese will have to wait for the pans and ovens of the American 18th century. Now, if you're wondering why I'm not covering yogurt here, it's because there was not a yogurt tradition at all in the British Atlantic. We'll have to wait until the 19th century for yogurt and other cultured dairy to start to make an impression on American food. So that wraps up what turned into a mini-series about the 17th century American cow. And it's the end of my summer schedule as well. I'm back to weekly episodes. So next week, we'll see what happens when, after years of rye and maize breads and uncivilized beer, the colonies finally find a place to grow the grains they miss. Wheat and barley farming finds a home in Pennsylvania. Thanks for listening. Show notes for this episode will be at thehistoryofamericanfood.blogspot.com. Any questions or quibbles can be addressed to me via email at thehistoryofamericanfood@gmail.com or on Twitter at THOAFood. And I've just started an Instagram feed as well, also at THOAFood. A quick review on Apple Podcasts or your preferred podcast widget does so much to help make the show more visible, as does telling your friends, family, and random acquaintances you connect with over food and history. Along with the promised pictures and links, I'll also include any interesting media I consumed for the episode in the show notes. Music for this podcast is Fingerlympics by Dr. Turtle. The link to the show notes is also on the show's Twitter bio at THOAFood and in the show description.